Well, healthcare spending, education spending, tax cuts, tax rebates. These issues are dominating the provincial election campaign. One issue we haven't heard much about, the province's growing debt. It's more than tripled in the past decade, and some experts say this cannot continue. So today on Blue Sky, we're going to look at what's at stake when governments take on big debt. And when does it make sense? We have a couple people standing by who give this kind of thing a lot of thought, and we know you do too. If you have thoughts on debt and the role it is or isn't playing in this election, knowing that tax cuts are one of the most consistent forms of revenues for the government, are they a good idea? Call 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Yeah, I totally misspoke there. Taxes are one of the most consistent forms of revenue for the government. So, of course, if they cut taxes, that decreases the amount of money they're bringing in. Well, CBC reporter Jason Warwick has been on the campaign trail, and he spoke with Morning Edition host Stephanie Langenegger about debt as an election issue. And she started by asking him how big the provincial debt is now.
Well, first, let's take our time machines way back to 2015, 10 years ago, back when Taylor Swift began to dominate the pop charts and Saskatchewan's general public debt was just $5 billion. Let's fast forward to today, and Taylor Swift is even bigger, but so is Saskatchewan's debt. In those 10 years, it has grown to nearly $20 billion. That's an increase in 10 years of 350%.
Yeah, so that's a lot.
It is. And that's just what we call the general debt. That doesn't include another category called specific debt, and that refers mostly to infrastructure projects. That's also been growing, and it's now at $11 billion. So the total debt for the province is actually more than $30 billion.
Who'd you talk to about this?
Well, I talked to a professor named Haizhen Mu. She's with the Johnson Choyama School of Public Policy at the U of S, and she says governments have to resist the temptation to pile up debt.
Over time, this deficit becomes debt, and the debt incur interest rate, right, payment. So the debt will just like a snowball will keep rolling and rolling and rolling bigger if you don't do anything about it.
Now, as Professor Mu said, Saskatchewan's snowball is just getting bigger and bigger. But it's not just those $30 billion I mentioned. There's also the interest payments.
And how much are the interest payments?
Well, this year alone, Saskatchewan taxpayers will fork over more than $700 million in interest. And all these big numbers can be hard to grasp. So I talked to another person. Gage Haubrick is with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. He put it in perspective. He says, the average family of four in Saskatchewan is paying more than $2,000 this year on their taxes just to the debt interest payments. That money, he says, could have hired 7,000 nurses or police officers across the province. So when I was out on the campaign trail in these past 2 weeks, I was in Saskatoon and North Battleford and Kenniston, elsewhere with the leaders. I found it interesting that the major party leaders barely talked about this. Gage Haubrick says that has to change.
Well, it's really unfortunate to not hear the party leaders focus on it more. One of the most important things the government can do is balance the budget and start to pay down debt, because that means that the government is going to be on the hook for less and less money that's going to be wasted in debt interest payments. Every single dollar the government adds in debt has to be paid back plus interest, and that's costing Saskatchewan taxpayers a lot of money this year.
Now, Stephanie, as I said, none of the party leaders were raising this much on the campaign trail, so we decided to ask them. Here's Saskatchewan party leader Scott Moe.
Plan one is to ensure that we have a long-term plan to keep the budget balanced on behalf of the people in Saskatchewan. We want to ensure we're continuing to grow the economy and invest in hospitals and schools and the people that are offering those services. But we always need to be focused on ensuring that debt is manageable over time, and when we can, decreasing it.
That was Saskatchewan party leader Scott Moe about the debt and deficit, and here's NDP leader Carla Beck.
We need to get the economy firing on all cylinders. Again, this government is presiding over a record of economic loss in 7 key sectors of the economy. We need to ensure that we've got the economy thriving on all sectors.
So as you can hear, there are other things on these party leaders' mind. In fact, neither party has a plan to balance the budget anytime soon. Both parties are planning deficit budgets for the next 3 years, and that means more debt and more interest payments.
Who else did you talk to about this, Jason?
Tom McIntosh. He's been following elections in this province since before Taylor Swift's first hit record.
Yeah, me too.
The University of Regina professor says most of the provincial debt has been accumulated by the Saskatchewan Party and the progressive conservative governments of the 80s. McIntosh said that made him surprised to see that the NDP isn't trying to make more of an issue of this.
I'm maybe not surprised that the Sask Party doesn't want to talk about it, because the overall provincial debt has increased significantly in the last 17 years, and not all of that can be blamed on the pandemic. Only a small part of it can be blamed on the pandemic. So I'm not surprised that they might not want to talk about it. I am kind of surprised that the NDP isn't making more of it. But it may also be that it's not an issue that right now is resonating with people.
Now, again, that was U of R political science professor Tom McIntosh, and he and the others say no matter who forms the next government, they can't keep piling up debt as they have for the past 10 years. And to quote the great Taylor Swift, Stephanie, you can't just shake it off or your balance sheet will have a big blank space, and that will create bad blood with taxpayers.
Who knew you were a Swiftie, Jason?
Surprise.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Surprise. Yeah, I wouldn't have followed along with those timelines if you wouldn't have had the Taylor Swift references in there. That, of course, was CBC reporter and Swiftie Jason Warwick speaking with Morning Edition host Stephanie Langenegger. I'm Leisha Gravinsky. This is Blue Sky. Now, while debt hasn't been a big campaign issue, it did come up during the leaders' debate last week. Here is NDP leader Carla Beck.
Let's talk about records here. Again, last time Mr. Moe was on this stage, he promised that he was going to make life more affordable, he was going to lower power bills, and he was going to balance the budget. Mr. Moe has added more debt to the people of Saskatchewan than any other premier in the history of Saskatchewan. He's done it in a record 6 years. Our plan is fully costed. It's going to take us 4 years to get there, but we're going to balance the budget at the end of 4 years. Because the reality is we can't afford not to make these investments in healthcare and education. Our plan, again, fully costed and supported by Ron Stiles, someone who served as DM Finance in this province, served a number of premiers in this province.
Thank you
so
much, Ms.
Our record versus
Beck.
his.
The name that NDP leader Carla Beck dropped there, Ron Stiles, is one of our guests today. He is the former CEO and president of SaskTel. He's now working as a senior advisor to the NDP, and he's here wearing that very partisan hat today. Ron Stiles, welcome to Blue Sky.
Thank you.
I wonder how many people Googled your name after Carla Beck name dropped you in the
I would think a few. I would think probably relatives mainly.
And then we are also joined by someone who's concerned that not enough attention is being paid to the debt. Jason Childs is an economics professor at the University of Regina. He's also published several pieces for the Fraser Institute focused on provincial spending and debt. He's here in a very nonpartisan role. And so, Jason Childs, welcome back to Blue Sky.
Thanks for having me back.
Good to have you. Now, before we go too much further, I want to play you both some tape from CBC's post-debate analysis show last week. Sam McCaig spoke with former Sask Party MLA Ken Kravets about the debt that the Sask Party has incurred, and here's his take on it.
Well, I think your record is what you run on. Absolutely. And I think when we look back at the last 17 years, if that's the record of the Saskatchewan Party, I'm part of that. I was part of that. So, when we look at the growth in this province, when we look at the fact, and Jens mentioned the debt, if you look back into the public accounts document that came out with the fiscal year March 31 of 2007, okay, just before the Saskatchewan Party became government, the government debt at that point was just over $7 billion. I had a chance to take a look at the public accounts document that just highlighted the fiscal year that ended on March 31st. The government operating debt is just over $7 billion. It has been up and down and up and down, but it's the government operating debt. All right? We used to refer to that as bad debt because that means that you are spending more than what you're receiving. Now, what has grown, and this is what we hear on the doorsteps from candidates, is the rest of the debt, the Crown Corporation debt, the business enterprise debt, the municipal financing corporation of the province. Actually, municipalities take advantage of borrowing money from the province that they use to build their own projects, water reservoirs, etc. That has grown. That has grown from the time of 2007. It has grown by about $8 billion because Sask Power, SaskTel, Sask Energy, they're all building things that are expensive. What has also grown is a capital debt. And the capital debt is, I think, is what Scott was trying to point out. We have, the Sask Party has built hospitals and nursing homes and schools, all requiring money to be borrowed. When I was finance minister, one of my last years, we borrowed money for 30 years, locked in at 2.8%. I don't think I'm giving away a political secret here, but it was locked in for 2.8% over 30 years. Everybody knows that if you're going to build your house, you're not going to wait until you save up every nickel and dime to build the house. You're now going to have debt. So now I hear from people saying, oh, the Scott Moe and the Sask Party has $31 billion worth of debt. Absolutely true. The government debt, the operating debt, is still just over $7 billion. Has not grown.
That is former Saskatchewan Party MLA Ken Kravets. And so we have a lot to unpack here. Jason Childs, I want to start with you. You kind of start to, I don't know, my head's spinning a bit, good debt versus bad debt. And I think we tend to draw on our own personal finances, and I don't know if that's the best comparison. But when you're looking at a provincial government, good debt versus bad debt, what exactly does that mean?
So you've got debt that you spent on something fun that's not going to generate an immediate economic return. And then you've got debt that you've spent on something that is going to generate an economic return or provide value over time. So if we want to stick with the household finance thing, your mortgage, that's pretty good debt. You're going to get value out of that house year after year after year that you live in it. If you borrow to go on a vacation or something fun like that, that's more akin to operating debt. And that's debt that's not going to generate value for you year after year after year. Once you've spent it and consumed it, it's gone. All you're left with really is the debt service cost. And so that's the distinction that's trying to be made here. And we do, in this province, thankfully, keep those accounts relatively separate. At the same time, we do have to service both debts. So both debts accumulate interest, and both, you've got to pay interest on it. Those bills come due every year.
Is it good to make those comparisons, a government's debt, in comparing it to someone's personal finances? Like, to me, when I look at government budgets, it's just like so beyond my comprehension in many ways, right? Like, I don't know what it costs to run a hospital. And so is it fair to make that comparison if I'm thinking about my own finances and how I'm budgeting our household? Can you apply that to government?
For the most part, yes. The basic mechanics are the same. The only difference is hopefully governments don't die. In terms of, I hope there's still a Saskatchewan government 50 years from now. I don't expect to be around that long. But at the same time, somebody's going to have to carry it, and somebody's going to have to pay for it. So you can deal with debt not being repaid, but you still have to service it. That's the big distinction for the provincial level. When you move up to the federal level, you get to play another game, and that's like, I can just print the money to pay for it. And that creates its own kind of mess.
Why is it so hard to say whether a budget is balanced or not? You laugh.
Yeah.
Why is
There's
it?
a lot of gamesmanship. I mean, first of all, budget documents are at best aspirational, at worst they're political documents. So they're not written for economists, and they're not really written for accountants. They're always politicized. And so there's games that get played. And so you can see different things moving into different accounts or being accounted for in different ways. And so it's really hard. And then it's a budget. A budget is a plan. It's not a reality. And so then you get these updates and you go, oh, wait a minute, this happened differently than we thought it was going to. And suddenly we've got more money going out than we expected, or less money coming in, or vice versa. And suddenly your plan has met reality and, well, it doesn't survive very long. So you've got that problem where you've got a budget and you're taking a best guess, and sometimes we get it right. Other times in the history of the province since I've been here, we've missed by an awful lot on some of those individual line items. I still remember potash revenues one year being forecast to be $2 billion and us ending up with $200 million instead. So you can miss. It's really easy to do, and because what you're doing is really, really hard. So that said, I'm a big proponent of caution in budgeting and caution in forecasting. And, I'd rather miss low than high in my budget.
So how would you characterize Saskatchewan's finances right now? Like how would you characterize the debt that the government has?
So one of the things you always have to think about in conjunction with all this, the taxpayers of Saskatchewan are on the hook for two sets of debts minimum, right? We've got the provincial debt, and then we've got the federal debt that we're on the hook for as well. Right, we've got to share that. We've got to service and maintain through our federal taxes. So that works out to about 80% of our GDP. So 80% of our income, all right, if we wanted to get rid of the debt, we'd have to spend nothing for 80% of the year. Right? You wouldn't even.
That sounds impossible. It's impossible.
No, it's not going to happen. Right? But that's the situation we're in. So we do have a little bit of runway for debt, but we don't have that much. And the chunks of that runway are constantly being eaten up right now by the federal deficit. So there's two things in play here. And because we're only dealing with one set of taxpayers for the provincial and federal debt, we've got a problem. And that, we might have a little bit of wiggle room right now. We're in about the third best shape of all the provinces in Canada.
The third best shape.
Yeah. Alberta and BC are slightly better off than we are when you do the attributions of debt, both federal and provincial. We're second or third. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I apologize for that. But there is some sort of debt threshold that seems to appear somewhere around 100% of GDP. We're on the right side of it for now, but we're going in the wrong direction.
I want to let Ron Stiles jump in here, and like I said at the beginning, you are coming wearing you're with the NDP, so a very much partisan position. But how would you characterize the situation that we're in right now in Saskatchewan when it comes to the amount of debt?
Well, I think the issue is to look at the trends, okay? Looking at an individual year, it gives you an idea what happened in that year. But if you look at multiple years, you get a bit of a sense of what's happening. And that, I think, is the real concern right now. If you start with 2018, you look at what was going on in 2018, and then you look at 24, 25, and you compare the numbers, okay? That's where I think people start to get scared. You're talking about a $14 billion jump in our overall debt. And so the pace of increase in the debt has really accelerated. It has over time. The other part of it is, if you look at specific governments and their spending trends, you start to get an idea of, their approach to managing the budget. And again, the last 6 years, what you've seen is a dramatic increase in the amount of debt that we've taken on, and a dramatic increase as well in expenditures and revenues. Our budget today, if you talk about revenues and expenses, is a $40 billion budget. I spent 5 years as deputy at the Ministry of Finance, and during my time there, we dealt with a total budget that was probably in around $14 billion, maybe a little less than that. And so it's the growth, the pattern that I think is what people are concerned about right now, and especially in the past number of years. If you look at the cost of that debt, the interest cost of it, okay, in the present budget, $911 million is set aside to pay for our debt. That's the interest cost on it. Now, the first quarter report this year, it's already up to $950 million. And that's 3 months from when they actually tabled the budget. It has gone up that much. Now, looking forward, and these are numbers that the government has released as a result of FOIs with them, it's going up over $100 million a year. We will have a $1 billion expenditure on debt starting in 25-26, and it will continue to grow and accelerate. It is the management of that overall debt, the amount of debt that is of most concern, and it creates additional risks, I think, that people should be aware of and be very concerned about. Interest rates right now are relatively low, but if interest rates, if we get a rebound, interest rates increase again, it accelerates the increase in interest costs, and that has been a problem in the past, the 1980s, 1990s, and it was a problem in the last few years. It looks like interest rates are finally falling off again.
I want to ask you, how the NDP would manage that and sort of what the headline coming out of the costing of the platform is from your perspective. But I just want to take a second to check in with the CBC's David Shield. And we've got several callers on the line wanting to ask some questions and share their thoughts. So that number to call is 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. I'm Leisha Grabinski. You are listening to Blue Sky. We have a couple of guests with us today. Let me just recap for you who we've got with us. Ron Stiles, former CEO and president of SaskTel. He's now working as a senior advisor to the NDP. And Jason Childs is an economics professor at the University of Regina. I'm going to let our listeners ask a few questions. We've got Katie on the line in Moose Jaw who joins us right now. Katie, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I was just wondering if you can talk me through how much the NDP is planning to invest in healthcare and how that's going to change hospitals. You know, I see the current government and they say that they're going to do things to help healthcare, but I don't really see great evidence of that. So I'm wondering if investing in hospitals would be an example of good debt.
It's a great question, Katie. Ron Stiles, I'll let you take that.
Well, there's two sides to this, okay? First of all, on the operating side, the money that is made available to fund an operation on a regular basis, we're looking at adding another $1.1 billion, okay, over the next 4 years. In addition, there has to be some acknowledgement that inflation is still going to be here. It might be 2% a year, it might be 2.5%, but there's going to be a need to continue to provide dollars, okay, to deal with that inflationary pressure. And so we're planning on injecting enough money again that we can start to make progress on improving healthcare here in Saskatchewan. There is a second part of it as well. Running government is not always just about the amount of money that you have available. It's how you manage that money and how you prioritize that money. Those become very, very important to what goes on. If you're trying to achieve multiple objectives in an area like health, for instance, okay, you have to be careful because there's a cost sometimes for that. And the government has decided to do things often quite differently, and there's a cost to that. If you're talking about travel nurses as an example, okay, the latest numbers that we've seen from Sun talks about a $75 million incremental cost for the travel nurses that have been there. So, you know, our strategy is about, first of all, you got to fund it all properly so it can operate. You got to fund people, the positions, you know, the things that are used on a day-to-day basis, the number of CAT scans, all of those things. On the capital side, there's going to be a need to try to increase capacity. Some of that seems to have already been started in the system finally, but anytime you've added a couple 100,000 people over a period of time, a relatively short period of time, it's going to put a lot of stress on your services. You need to increase capacity. Now, sometimes increasing capacity is just looking at efficiency in an operation, but sometimes you physically have to have more space. More people, it's more space. So money will have to be invested to create that additional capacity over time. From our perspective, very difficult to get into exactly where we would do something with capacity. It's something, again, that you have to look at the books, you have to go through all of that, you have to understand what the availability is within the present system. One of the things we want to do to increase capacity is open up, for instance, the City Hospital in Saskatoon on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis. The emergency system there doesn't operate on that kind of a basis. We want to get it fully engaged, okay, and it's making good use of the existing space and the existing facilities. So, you know, there's a multiple of answers that really are there, but I can tell you that, you know, it is one of those areas that is fundamental from a priority perspective for us. You know, every government has different priorities, but for us, it is health, it is education, it is the economy, and finally, it's about affordability.
So, Jason, I want you to jump in there, and I'm just curious, you know, as you're listening to this, where might you want us to pause, like as voters, just to think more critically about what Ron Stiles is saying there?
Well, I don't want to nitpick, but and it really does. And Ron's absolutely correct. It does come down to the details of where you put the money and how you make it available. And that's one of the big question marks. When you look across the country, I don't think anybody is doing this file stellarly. I think there's always ways to do it better and different. I think that conversation, I would love to see that conversation take center stage in this election, but that's not what's happened. It's been they're underfunding or they're doing this or they're doing that. It's not like, okay, let's step back for a second. What do we need this thing to do? And what is that going to cost us? And how are we going to raise those funds without just running up debt? because that seems to be the sort of the fallback. Oh, we'll accrue some extra debt, and we'll throw it at the problem, when it could be we completely need to restructure this thing.
Let's go to another caller. So Hal joins us right now in Saskatoon. Hal, welcome to Blue Sky.
Yeah, hi, Alicia. Thanks for having me. I've got a question for Mr. Stiles, actually.
Go ahead.
So, Mr. Stiles, you were a senior civil servant and Crown Corporation CEO under both an NDP government and a Sask Party government. So, I was wondering how you would compare their financial management styles in light of the fact that during the Wall government's tenure, you arbitrarily fired a bunch of managers when you were the CEO of SaskTel. And that was at a time when the economy was still in quite good shape and the corporation's profits were very healthy. So this is all considering that mass firings at Crown corporations never happened under the Romano government, despite the dire financial situation that the province was left in when they took over from the Grand Divine regime.
So first, let me touch on the difference between the governments, okay? And there's sort of a very easy statistic here that illustrates it. When you look at all the debt that has been piled up here in the province, okay, and what looks like to be the number at the end of 24-25, it's going to be about about $35 billion, okay? 95% of all of that debt has been accrued by two governments, okay? The Divine government and the Sask Party government, primarily the Sask Party government in its last 6 years. And so that, I think, speaks very well to, again, the financial approach that's taken by different governments and different parties. If you talk about individual management decisions, and that's what you're referring to, okay, whether it's within the Crown sector or within government, there's always tough decisions that need to be made. It is essential that government operate as efficiently as possible. And that can be done in a variety of different ways. Again, staff changes, staff reductions are all part and parcel of it. You've seen it by every government, okay, going back. I worked for a few years actually in the Blakeney government as well. So again, it's something that is normal course of business. Governments must operate efficiently. You're using taxpayers' dollars. It is important that people get value for money. It's important that organizations continue to change over time, and you're going to see that going forward as well. I think Jason covered it very well. When you're talking about something like health is a evolving area. I mean, you look at drugs and some of the drugs that are out there, okay, genetics, those sorts of things. Health is going to have to continue to adjust and change. And there are new approaches. Recently in a meeting with several doctors, one of the things they talked a lot about is the fact that AI is now being used to look at radiology. All these things are going to have to be integrated. Again, it's just part of evolution. But a good government tries to go with that flow, tries to build on it, and tries to make sure things are as efficient as possible. Sometimes we think government services are free. They're never free. Okay? They always come from a tax base.
You got a chuckle out of Jason there. Yeah. Jason, I want to put part of Hal's question to you. Sure. Which party do you think is best at managing our finances?
I don't like anybody.
That's a safe answer, I think. I
am a devout nonpartisan. I think one of the problems with government is the longer you're involved and associated with government at whatever level, you think it can do more and more and better, right? Because you're involved in it, you're doing it. Of course, you're a good person, and of course, you're intelligent and thinking it through, so that the role that you want to assign to government is going to expand. And I think that's one of the places where we can get ourselves into trouble really, really quickly. And the longer you're in government, and I'll pull out the old Blakeney quote, first day you're elected to office, they give you a backpack. Every day you show up after that, they put a pebble in it, right? And it adds up after a time, and it's going to drag you down. And I think it's being in that role is demanding and hard on you, and I think your decision-making capacity erodes over time.
Ron Stiles, I want to ask you why you wanted to be a senior advisor to the NDP. I think that's an important question. It's likely on the minds of listeners right now. Why is that the party that you're working for?
Well, essentially, I had shifted to the private sector and was doing consulting. I've done some teaching over time as well, and very much was enjoying sort of that life, I guess. I was glad to be out of government. I'd been there for 38 years in a lot of different positions for a lot of different premiers over time. I worked in a minority government, actually, and worked for a Liberal cabinet minister, if you can believe that, here in Saskatchewan. I think that's a pretty rare bird right now. But, my concern was with what was going on in the province, okay? What I've seen since I left, sort of 2018 to now, is I've seen a government that doesn't seem to represent the priorities, of the people of the province. I'm very concerned about what's going on in education, very concerned about healthcare, These are all things that my family uses, that my grandsons use. And again, those things concern me. And if they're not taking care of those things, there's not a good future for the province. Those things, good education, good health care, people being able to afford a house, all those things are very, very important, It speaks to quality of life. So I was very, very concerned about that and sort of got drawn in a fair bit to what I thought was a party and a leader, and it's a lot to do with the leader, that I believe has all the right intentions. Things like ethics play a part in it for me. Ethics are very, very important, I believe you have to have that kind of a foundation. You have to care about people to a large extent. And those are all things that sort of played into it. And so sort of the next thing I know, I'm involved in politics, with the NDP. But for a long period of time, I stayed, devoutly away from it. Only when I thought there was something here that was very problematic and that needed to be addressed. And I thought I'd better sort of pick up and help.
So now that you're in the role that you're in, I mean, there are some tough questions being posed to you. The NDP has promised to cut the fuel tax, stop charging PST on children's clothing and groceries. And so if there are all those tax cuts, where does the money come from to make up for that?
Well, what we've done is we've built a budget, a public finance package, based on 3 documents, First of all, we've used the forecast that the Sask Party and the Ministry of Finance have put out in the last budget, the 24-25 budget. So we've used that as one of the starting points for everything. We believe that they should understand or should have a good handle, on what's going to happen with revenues and should have a pretty good handle on what's going to happen to expenses. So we've used that as a starting point. We've updated that for the information that was put out by the government of Saskatchewan in its first quarter financial report. And then finally, we had a look at the 23-24 public accounts. These are the audited financial statements, for the government of Saskatchewan. They tell you what actually happened in 23-24. They weren't available when the budget was dropped back in March for 24-25. So we've looked at those. We've made some adjustments to account for the fact that the government missed its revenue target, understated its revenue target by $600 million in the 24-25 budget with respect to where 23-24 was going to fall out the previous year. Now, that kind of a mistake or a miss, however you want to phrase it, needs to be incorporated into the forecast going forward. And so we have made an adjustment, for that missing piece of data, if you can say. We've used that to build out the kind of dollars that are available that we believe in the 4 out years, We've used that as a bit of the base. We've put in money for inflation. Every part of government, whether it's education, health, social services, is going to have some inflation. So we've set aside money for that. And with the remaining money, we've decided on where our priorities are. And again, our priorities are 4 areas, and we've stuck sort of very close to that. We believe this is as good as a forecast as you could possibly find. And again, it's all based on the government's information and data. None of it is based on something that we came up with or assumptions that we made. It's based on audited financial statements, in the existing budget. That's why when we've heard some of the comments from time to time, it makes us wonder, is there something wrong with the government financial statements? Is there something wrong with the government's budget that they tabled in 24-25?
Let's go to some listeners who've got some questions, some follow-up questions. Ralph in Cabri joins us right now. Ralph, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, and to your guests. I guess fiscal conservatives are much like Sasquatches to me. We've all heard of them, but no one's actually seen one. So if my problem, I think, is the royalty structure, and I know it's more of the revenue issue, but Saskatchewan and Alberta have the lowest royalty rates in the Western world. Even Nigeria or Azerbaijan have better royalty rates than what we get. We seem to give it away. It's very good for the royalty company, for the resource companies, but as a province, I don't think we are collecting enough. I mean, even during some of the highest commodity prices in years and years, we end up getting kind of screwed here. You look at even Alaska, where they have a windfall profit rate, where if it goes above a certain rate, the state itself gets more money. We don't have that. We have royalty holidays right now when they shouldn't be. I don't know. I just think that somewhere along the line, this contributes to us having to put more PSC on everything, to try to put money into education and healthcare and whatever else, because we, as a resource province, are not getting what we should out of this.
Great question, Ralph. Let's get our guests to answer. It's something that's come up on the show. We've invited all of the leaders from the different parties on the program. A few have brought this up. We did invite Scott Moe, but they declined. So I maybe Jason, I'll start with you, just the nonpartisan answer. Are we getting enough? How would you...
That's always a tricky question because the royalty structures in this province particularly are incredibly complex. Just talking to someone in government the other day, and our royalty structures are really complicated. We generate, depending on how you want to count, somewhere around 20 to 25% of our revenue every year comes from royalties, which is a huge chunk. Just oil and gas alone generates about $1 billion out of a $20 billion budget every single year. So we're getting a fair bit. Is that enough? Is it the right number? That's really hard to say. You really have to have that discussion about, well, what's going to happen if we crank up the royalties? We saw what happened shortly around 2014, 2015 when the oil prices really shifted and changed and some rules changed, particularly in Alberta. A lot of those rigs left Alberta and went down to Texas and other jurisdictions and have not come back. So my advice would be, yeah, we should be looking at it. We should be having that discussion. I would be all in favor of a much simpler royalty structure so it's easier to figure out as an outsider what somebody owes or doesn't owe. But I'd be hugely in favor of reviewing and simplifying that structure. But tread carefully would be my advice.
Mr. Stiles, why is the NDP considering raising royalties? What's the party's stance on that?
No, I mean, we've taken the position, okay, there'll be no tax changes or tax increases for the next 4 years. So that is our official position. I think Jason has outlined this very well. I would add a couple of things to it, okay? If you're talking about, for instance, oil and gas production in Saskatchewan has actually fallen in the past 6 years, pardon me. And so we got to be very careful. Okay, you got to have an environment that's going to attract companies. That's going to make sure those companies are profitable to some extent and are able to grow and develop. And that has not happened in the past 6 years. And so, we need to be very careful about what we do. And that's exactly what Jason is saying. The same goes for potash. We have a new mine that's going to come on in 2026. That new mine is going to add 8.5 million tons of new potash potentially, okay, to the world markets. Just think of your supply and demand. We're going to supply a lot more potash. And demand is probably going to just incrementally go up 1% a year. That means that there should be lots of concern as to what's going to happen with potash prices, okay, over the next 4 or 5 years. They need some stability. That industry does, and that's exactly what we want to deliver to them at this point in time. Hopefully they'll grow. Hopefully we won't see any contraction in terms of prices. But the idea that there might be some rapid increase in potash prices, okay, starting in 2026, it simply is not possible. Not when you're going to add that much more potash to the world markets. And this is the mine up at BHP up at Jensen. So again, big
mine we've been
concern.
talking about for many, many years.
Yes, absolutely. Right. And it's finally going to go into production, it looks like. So, but those are concerns. And I think you have to be very careful about what you do. Again, I don't think you just want to sort of jump on things willy-nilly. You want to keep the jobs. You want to keep the existing revenues that you have. And you want to grow that over time. I mean, that is the objective of all governments. And again, these resources belong to the people of Saskatchewan. But you got to be very careful.
Okay, let's go to another caller. So Maria in Swift Current joins us right now. Maria, welcome to Blue Sky.
Thanks. This is actually maybe adding a little more context to this conversation about resources. So government is supposed to govern for the benefit of the commons over any private interest. And we have something called peace, order, and good governance. Now, from what I see is, back when the cooperative movement started, I believe some of our resources were owned by the people. And when you think of treaty and our laws, it feels like to privatize our resources is a blatant contravention of the duty to the people to ensure good governance and to abide by treaty. And I just want to know why we aren't talking about expropriating these resources and bringing them back to the people so that we can provide for everyone.
Ron Stiles, I'll let you go first.
Well, it's important to understand with these kind of resources, okay, it takes a lot of money to be able to mine them. It takes a lot of expertise. It takes access to world markets. It is essentially a key to make sure that you have parts of the private sector that are in and are participating in these kind of arrangements. There are examples. Again, countries in the Middle East, I guess, is maybe one of the key ones, okay, where they've set up their own crown corporations, okay. We call them crowns. They have a little different phrase, but I'll just call them all crown corporations. And they have taken that position and that approach. It is a debate within government. It is a debate between right and left. It's a debate upon what the right way to go about all this is. And again, in Saskatchewan, it's played out over time with different approaches. So you saw where potash, okay, was expropriated going back into the, I believe, 1960s, if I remember correctly, okay? And then it was privatized and put back into a company here in Saskatchewan. And now that company as well has ended up merging with another company, Agrium, okay, to form Nutrien. And so you've seen sort of variations in all of this. And again, it's always a debate which is better and which isn't better, okay? But there is a need for this expertise. You know, make no doubt about it. The mine that is up at Jansen Lake, the amount of money they had to put into it, you're talking billions and billions of dollars have had to go into that. The technology is very specialized. So the capability or capacity of a government to do those sorts of things, I think, is starting to erode over time. Again, a higher level of sophistication, government isn't necessarily the best vehicle to do something like that. But that's been an ongoing debate. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, and I'm sure that people will continue to have much different views.
Okay. We're going to go to another caller, Loretta in Saskatoon. Hi, Loretta. Welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi. I want to check you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Go right ahead.
Okay. What bothers me so much, what is so painful, is the promotion of how affordable Saskatchewan is to live in. I've heard it over and over again, and here's what it takes. I've lived here my whole life, 56 years. Here's what it takes to live affordably in Saskatchewan. It's to maintain the highest per capita interpersonal violence rates in Canada, over double the national average for years. To live here is to maintain the second highest drunk driving incidents in Canada for years. To live here is to find to date the most unmarked residential school grades in Canada while maintaining the highest overrepresentation of adult Indigenous people incarcerated. 43 out of 10,000 is the national average. Saskatchewan runs at 101. To live here affordably is to maintain the lowest, tied with Alberta, minimum wage in Canada. And to live here affordably is to maintain the highest per capita rate of drug and alcohol addiction in the country.
And Loretta, what would you say we're focusing a lot on debt today, and I hear the points that you're raising, and I even hear things that I think I've read about in the NDP campaign, minimum wage being one. But we've got Jason Childs and Ron Stiles here, and I'm curious what your specific question might be, either for Jason Childs, the economist, or for Ron Stiles, who is with the NDP.
To both. What stopped in the past and what stops any party from repairing these statistics at once and for all with the good debt?
Good question, Mr. Stiles.
Well, I mean, that's a very broad question, very large question. It's important to understand that the standard of living here in Saskatchewan, okay, has deteriorated over the past number of years, and quite significantly. Our mortality rates right now are down by 3 years. People are not living as long as they did just a number of years ago. 6-7 years. So these things are all concerning. Again, spousal violence, again, highest rates in Canada. I think that's an issue of priorities. At least that's what we believe from an NDP perspective. This is an issue of priorities. Where do you put your money? What's important? And again, these are things from a health perspective and education perspective we believe are very, very important to come back to and to address. You can't expect to get rid of safety problems in schools by cutting the budget every year. And again, I mean, you simply have to look at the number of incidents, okay? The incident with somebody starting another individual on fire up in Saskatoon is probably the most recent egregious example of that. You can't cut budgets all the time. Again, the last number of years, there's been one teacher hired for the last 15,000 students.
And this is where I want to bring in Jason Childs, because we're not going to have a ton of time to go into everything. But I think, listening to what Ron Stiles says are the priorities of the NDP, and a lot of that will take money. And at the same time, we started the show by raising some concerns about debt. Right. So, Jason, when you look at both of the campaign platforms and you look at the amount of debt and the pricing of all of this, which do you have the most faith in?
I'm gonna go off the board and go neither. Again, these are forecasts, they're budgets, they're guesses, but just taking them at their plans, I did run the numbers completely. And if we just look at what's in the proposal, the Sask Party's planning to add by the end of the 28-29, like that budget year, is planning to add about $380 million in debt. The NDP platform, once it's all costed out, is $771.5 million in extra debt. So there is a difference. Now, where that debt is being spent or used is different between the two platforms. The Sask Party platform is much more shotgun, shall we say, broad brush. A lot of it spent on tax relief or changes to, say, the minimum deduction. Whereas the NDP is a lot of it's on the spending side, and it's very much targeted. And it's going to go to teachers and it's going to go to nurses or healthcare generally. And so those are the two big. You can look at who the constituencies are. You can infer that from these budget documents, but there is a difference in the total debt, and I don't see. To get back to the caller's point, throwing money at any of those problems mentioned isn't going to solve them. So and that makes it directly out of my depth.
Right. Just one last question for you, Jason. What do you want people to keep in mind when they go to vote, and how high on the priority list should be the debt when they go to vote?
I think it should be key because debt does a couple of things that we probably don't like. One, every time you run debt, you're transferring money from the general taxpayer to wealthy individuals, and the wealthy individuals who are wealthy enough to lend government money. In a lot of cases, that's pension funds. So there's that. It also means every dollar of debt service, and we both talked about this, and I think we're actually sort of in agreement here, that when you're spending $1 billion a year to service the debt, that's $1 billion you can't spend on anything else. And that's, Grant, I feel I got to defend Divine a little bit, which is weird for me. I'm not a big Divine fan. But a lot of that debt that was accrued was actually not program spending. It was deficit. It was debt service that was ramped up to, just roll it over and borrow more money to pay the interest. That's a miserable place to be. So that's what we're looking at. And so there's some real growth implications too with debt that we haven't touched on.
Okay, this has been really interesting. Voting has started officially today, and then the big election day is October 28th. So thanks for all this information. Ron Stiles, thank you.
Thank you.
And Jason Childs, thanks to you too.
Thank you.